Welcome to the Road to Revolution lecture. This is going to include the French and Indian War, which was a major turning point in the lives of the colonists, and it's also going to include the early stages leading up to the American Revolution, hence the Road to Revolution. So first of all, let's talk about the competition for control of North America. There were three major European powers in North America that struggled for control of the continent, each against each other and against the native peoples living there. Those were the British, the French, and the Spanish. The Russians had claims too, but theirs were further up in the northwest. In the southeast, Indians made several attempts between 1650 and 1711 to keep British settlers from expanding their control further inland. In northern areas such as New York, New England, and Canada, British and French settlers battled for dominance, with Indians joining in on one side or another. In 1689 through 97, King William's War, English, Dutch, and Dutch settlers in the northeast allied with the Iroquois to attack the French and other Indian tribes in New France, which is now what we call Canada. Most of the suffering in this area fell upon the Iroquois and other native tribes. English, Dutch, and French lost 1,300 people in almost 10 years of fighting. Iroquois learned a lesson: remain neutral, playing two sides off against each other. The French and the Spanish settlement of North America reached its peak by 1750, and this quickly declined afterwards, and you can see this in this image. So there was some war going on in Europe, and that spills over to the North American continent. So we're talking about the roots of the French and Indian War. In Europe, it was known as the 7 Years' War. It was a struggle for control of the continent between France and England. English fur traders began to venture into French-controlled territory, which was western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, which was also known as the Ohio Country, or the Ohio River Valley, in 1752. The French began to build a series of forts to protect their fur-bearing regions. George Washington and Edward Braddock led ill-fated missions in 1754 and 1755 against the French outposts. Both parties were badly beaten by the French and the Indian forces. So your first clashes right here at Fort Necessity, led by George Washington on the British side, against the French, and then at Fort Duquesne. And at Fort Duquesne, Delaware and Shawnee Indians became involved. And you can see how important this Ohio River Valley is right here for particularly beaver pelts, because beaver fur was very much in demand in Europe. In 1754, Ben Franklin leads some representatives from New England, New York, Maryland, and Pennsylvania in the Albany Congress to write the Albany Plan of Union, which ultimately fails. And during this time, the Iroquois broke off relations with Britain and threatened to trade with the French. It's a famous illustration by Benjamin Franklin during the French and Indian War, convincing settlers to join. So the fighting begins to heat up. In 1755, Britain decides to eliminate French presence in North America. General Braddock evicts the French from the Ohio Valley and Canada. There are attacks in the Ohio Valley, in the Mohawk Valley, and in Acadia. They kill very close to Fort Duquesne, 1,500 French and Indian forces, and the only Braddock success was they managed to expel the French from Canada, and they ended up in Louisiana, and they're known as the French Cajuns. In 1756, war is officially declared. The Native American tribes are exploited by both sides, the French and the English. From 1757 to 1760, a combined British colonial force fought against the French and their native allies. During this time, the British-led forces captured all the major French outposts. By 1763, France, Spain, and Britain signed the Treaty of Paris, giving most of the control in North America to Great Britain. Spain surrendered its claims to Florida under that Treaty of Paris. So here you can see the map has changed pretty dramatically from 1750 to 1763. You can see that now most of it is British territory. So what was this impact of the war? Again, you can see the map over here of pre-war boundaries and then post-war boundaries. So the impact of this war, France was excluded from North America, creates some pretty big bitterness that comes back to haunt us later. Native American tribes would no longer play the Europeans off each other, and to prevent Indian uprisings, Britain issued the Proclamation of 1763. No colonists would be allowed past the headwaters of the Appalachian Mountains on the Atlantic side. Now, the interesting thing about that is that doesn't last very long. And as we know, we push further and further westward. So this had some pretty big effects on the American colonies, which really do set us up for colonial independence and the Revolution. Colonists began to look at their situation in a new light. 1/3 of New England men fought in the war with the British. However, it was a very class-separated army, and they didn't like how that was set up, and the inability of colonists to move up within the ranks. There was very harsh discipline in this army, and there was also this refusal of the British to sort of honor agreements made with the colonists. Many considered the British tyrants as a result of this. So, one, it united the colonists against a common enemy for the first time, being the British. It created a socializing experience for all colonials who participated, so those men who were part of the military sort of had a common bond, and it created bitter feelings towards the British that would only intensify over the next few years. So there were also some impacts on Great Britain. One, it increased her colonial empire in the Americas, made it much bigger. It greatly enlarged England's debt because fighting a war on foreign soil is very expensive. Britain created this contempt for these colonials that created a bitterness in England itself among English people. And so the English felt after the war that the colonies needed a major reorganization to sort of bring it back into that empire and bring it back into the fold. And you can see this might cause some resistance amongst the colonies. So here you see some causes and the effects of that. So this is where we're going to start the next lecture. And this is sort of the deep roots of the Revolution. It begins before the colonists even set foot on American soil with the rights of the Englishmen. The war of the French and Indian War was intense and highly expensive. And you have sort of this independent mindset that these colonists have. So we'll continue with the road to revolution in our next lecture.